In the fall of 1944, as the war raged across Europe, a group of German soldiers found themselves captured by American forces during a fierce battle on the Western Front. Exhausted, disoriented, and unsure of what to expect, they were transported to a prisoner of war camp in the United States. These men, raised on propaganda that portrayed the Americans as brutal and merciless, were ready to endure the worst. They had been taught that their captors would torture them, starve them, and subject them to unimaginable cruelty. Yet, as they arrived at the camp, their fears began to clash with reality. The first thing they noticed was the cleanliness of the camp. The barracks, though simple, were well kept, and the food they were given, although basic, was more than they expected. In their previous experiences, they had only known starvation and fear. They had expected to be treated like animals, locked in filthy cells with barely enough sustenance to survive. But here, they were met with something entirely different: organization, order, and a strange sense of hospitality. Their arrival was marked by a surreal moment when American soldiers handed them their first meal. It was nothing extravagant, just a simple ration, but to them it felt like a luxury. The food was warm and nutritious, a far cry from the scraps they had been accustomed to in the field. As they ate in silence, the reality of their situation began to sink in. How could these people, whom they had been taught to hate, treat them with such basic decency? Despite the food and comfort, the tension in the air was palpable. The prisoners couldn't shake the belief that this kindness was a trick, a way to make them lower their guard before the real suffering began. But as days passed, the treatment remained civil, even respectful. The Americans never once raised their voices or made them feel inferior. Instead, they were addressed politely, with a level of dignity that was completely unexpected. Die Soldaten, still skeptisch, begannen zu noten die kleinen Dinge. Die Guards, weil Stern, waren nicht die Monster, die hat bewundert erbaut. Some even grüßte die Prisoners mit Nods oder briefe Konversationen, asking about their health oder offerierten Assistenz, wenn nötig. Dies Level von Humanität seemed inkomprensibel für Men, die eine Idee von der hatten, dass ihre Enemies subhuman waren. Slowly, die walls of hostility begannen zu eroden, replaced by confusion und curiosity. It wasn't just the food and the politeness that caught them off guard. It was the overall atmosphere of the camp. There was no constant threat of violence, no looming fear of punishment for minor infractions. The camp had rules, of course, but they were enforced with reason rather than brutality. For the first time in what felt like years, the prisoners felt something they hadn't known in a long time: safety. As the days passed, the soldiers found themselves adjusting to this strange new world. They were still prisoners, still at the mercy of their captors, but they began to realize that their situation wasn't as dire as they had imagined. They were being treated like human beings, not like animals to be slaughtered or discarded. For some, this realization was a bitter pill to swallow. They had been trained to view their captors as the enemy, as people to be despised. Now, they had to confront the uncomfortable truth that their captors were showing them more kindness than they had ever experienced in their own homeland. In the evenings, as the prisoners sat together, some began to talk. They shared stories of their lives before the war, their families, their homes. There was a palpable sense of disbelief in the air, as though none of them could quite accept the kindness they were receiving. One soldier, a grizzled veteran who had been in several battles, remarked that he had expected to be beaten, tortured, or left to starve. Instead, he found himself sitting at a table with a warm meal in front of him, a feeling of gratitude slowly creeping in. Despite the overwhelming evidence that their captors were treating them with a level of humanity they had not expected, a part of them resisted. The propaganda they had grown up with was too deeply ingrained. They had been taught to hate their enemies, to view them as less than human. But here, in this American camp, their enemies were offering them something entirely different: respect. It was a difficult concept to reconcile, and many of them struggled with it. The days turned into weeks, and the prisoners began to settle into a routine. They attended briefings, worked on small tasks assigned to them, and participated in educational programs designed to help them adjust to their new life. The camp, once a place of fear, began to feel more like a strange home. The guards, once seen as the enemy, were now just people doing their jobs, many of whom spoke kindly to the prisoners. It wasn't until one fateful day that the full weight of their situation began to sink in. As they were served their first cup of coffee, the soldiers realized just how different this experience was from what they had imagined. The coffee was rich, aromatic, and unlike anything they had ever tasted in their time as soldiers. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The warmth of the cup in their hands, the steam rising from the surface, the rich, bold flavor, all of it felt like a gift from a world they didn't understand. How could something so simple, so ordinary, carry so much weight? How could they be receiving this from the very people they had been taught to hate? For the first time, the prisoners allowed themselves to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were more than just pawns in a brutal game. They began to question the narrative they had been taught, the lies that had shaped their understanding of the world. The coffee, in its simple richness, became a symbol of the unexpected mercy that could be found even in the most unlikely places. In the quiet moments, as they sat with their cups, the German soldiers began to think about what it meant to be human. They had always been told that to survive, they had to be strong, unyielding, and ruthless. Now, they were learning that survival didn't have to come at the expense of kindness, respect, and dignity. And, for the first time, they began to wonder what kind of world they would return to once the war was over. Would they be able to live in a world where mercy, instead of hatred, was the guiding principle? The coffee had opened their eyes, but it also opened a door to a new, more complicated question. Could they ever truly see their enemies as human again? The days following their arrival in the camp unfolded slowly for the German prisoners. Initially, the sheer monotony of their captivity felt overwhelming, but as they adapted, small details began to surface that unsettled their expectations. The camp wasn't the brutal place they had imagined. It was calm, almost organized. There were rules to follow, of course, but there was no sense of chaos, no oppressive fear that seemed to hang over them in every other prisoner of war experience they had heard about. The uncertainty that accompanied their capture slowly transformed into an uncomfortable calm. The food, simple as it was, remained a constant source of confusion for the prisoners. Every meal seemed more generous than the last, with servings of bread, vegetables, and even meat. At first, the soldiers had hesitated, unsure of how to approach these meals. They had been taught to expect starvation, cruelty, and degradation. Instead, they were fed with respect. It was as if their captors were treating them like human beings, offering them food that wasn't just sustenance, but a gesture of something more. Some of the prisoners couldn't help but glance around in disbelief, questioning whether it was some kind of trap. Could this be a trick? Was the food somehow poisoned, designed to break their resolve before something worse happened? But as they tasted the bread, the potatoes, the meat, and the strange sweetness of the fruit, they found it impossible to keep up their suspicions. The food was real, and it was filling. There was no malice here, no hidden agenda in the simple act of feeding them. The unexpected generosity created a strange atmosphere. The guards, who were once viewed as enemies, now seemed almost like distant figures in the background of a strange new world. Their presence was still a constant reminder of the reality of their situation, but it was no longer accompanied by the tension that the prisoners had once expected. The guards were polite, even distant, in a way that made the soldiers feel more like guests in an unfamiliar home than enemies in a hostile territory. They moved with a quiet professionalism, speaking only when necessary, and always with a level of politeness that left the prisoners uncertain of how to respond. What made it all the more surreal was the coffee. The prisoners had expected to be given water, maybe even some watered-down broth, but the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, strong and inviting, filled the camp's mess hall one morning. They stared at the cups placed in front of them with confusion. Coffee was a luxury, something reserved for officers or civilians back home. It wasn't something soldiers in the field could indulge in. And yet here it was, in abundance, handed to them with the same politeness and care as the bread and meat. Some prisoners hesitated before taking their first sip, unsure of what to make of it. Others dove in immediately, the warmth of the cup against their hands offering comfort they hadn't realized they'd missed. The taste was rich, smooth, and almost decadent compared to the bitter, thin coffee they had been accustomed to in the field. It was a revelation, a moment of absurd indulgence in the midst of their captivity. As they drank, some prisoners began to talk, though the conversations were strained at first. How could they not be? They had been taught to view their captors with hatred, to see them as monsters. But now, as they sat with their coffee and food, they found it difficult to reconcile the humanity they were being shown with the demonized images they had carried in their minds. One man, a sergeant, sat back after his first sip of coffee and let out a low whistle, muttering to no one in particular, "This is real. This isn't what I thought it would be." His words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. It was as if everyone in the room had been struck by the same realization. They had been wrong. The enemy they had been taught to fear, to despise, wasn't what they had imagined. Despite the rising confusion, some prisoners began to settle into their new routine. They were given tasks to do around the camp, some working in the gardens, others maintaining the grounds. But all the while, the coffee was a constant. Every day they were served another cup, the steam rising from the cup a steady reminder of the strange hospitality they were receiving. No one had ever expected to find themselves in such a situation, living as prisoners but treated with such surprising respect. It was a jarring contrast to the stories they had been told growing up, stories of the Americans as ruthless and unforgiving. Yet here they were, in this camp, drinking coffee, eating meals, and slowly coming to terms with the unsettling reality that their captors were not monsters, but people who had a strange sense of dignity and humanity. There was a sense of disorientation among the men. In the evenings, after they had finished their work and eaten their meals, they would sit in their barracks, staring at the walls in silence. The quietness of the camp was almost oppressive. No yelling, no harsh commands. Just a quiet rhythm of daily life that seemed out of place for prisoners of war. It was a life they hadn't anticipated, and the longer they stayed, the more they began to question everything they had been taught. Could it really be that their enemies had a sense of honor, a sense of care? Could it be that there was something more to humanity than the fight for survival, something more than just the hatred that had been instilled in them? And then there was the growing realization that the coffee wasn't just a drink. It had become a symbol. It wasn't about the taste or the warmth. It was about the fact that the Americans had given it to them, without hesitation, without suspicion. It was a simple act of kindness, a gesture that had been offered freely, without strings attached. For many of the soldiers, it was a turning point. They could no longer deny the contradiction they faced. How could the same people who had captured them also show such human compassion? By the end of the week, the prisoners began to adjust to this strange new reality. They still didn't understand everything, and they still carried the weight of their military training with them. But the coffee and the kindness were beginning to chip away at the walls they had built around themselves. They had arrived expecting cruelty and punishment, but they were slowly being shown that there was more to the world than the hatred they had been raised to believe in. It wasn't an easy transition, and it certainly didn't erase the anger and confusion, but it was a start, a small, warm cup of coffee in a cold, unfamiliar world. As the days in the camp dragged on, the German soldiers found themselves caught in a web of confusion and disbelief. What they had initially perceived as mere survival in captivity began to evolve into something far more complex. The daily routine of eating, working, and drinking coffee, though seemingly mundane, slowly began to unravel the beliefs they had been taught about their captors. They had come expecting nothing more than cruelty, punishment, and humiliation, but instead they were treated with respect and decency. For many, this created an internal conflict that was impossible to ignore. One of the first signs that something had changed was the way the American guards interacted with them. There were no harsh commands, no threats of violence, and no intimidation tactics. The guards spoke to them with calm voices, using phrases like please and thank you. These words, so simple and yet so foreign to the prisoners, began to sink in. At first, the prisoners were confused by the politeness. They had been taught to fear the American soldiers, to see them as cold and merciless. But here, they were encountering something entirely different. It wasn't just that the guards were polite, it was that they seemed to genuinely care about the well-being of the prisoners. The soldiers had expected to be treated like animals, kept in cages and fed just enough to keep them alive. But instead, they were given the chance to work, to engage with the camp's daily activities, and even to learn. The camp had an educational program for the prisoners, where they could learn English and engage in discussions about life before the war. For some of the prisoners, this was a strange experience. They had been trained to view the English language and the culture it represented with contempt, yet now they were being asked to embrace it, to study it with the same seriousness as they would a military manual. This intellectual exercise felt like a betrayal of everything they had been taught, but it also opened doors they hadn't anticipated. At first, many of the soldiers resisted the idea of learning from their captors. They felt that by participating in the camp's programs, they were somehow compromising their integrity. They were supposed to be the victors, not the ones receiving lessons from the enemy. But as time went on, the soldiers began to see the value in the education they were receiving. It wasn't just about learning a language, it was about understanding a way of life, a culture that had once seemed foreign and hostile, but was now taking shape in front of them. They began to realize that the Americans, like them, were human beings with their own values, beliefs, and traditions. This growing awareness was unsettling for many of the prisoners. They had been raised to view the world in a rigid, black-and-white manner, where the enemy was always evil and their side was always righteous. But now they were being confronted with the complexity of human relationships. They were being forced to acknowledge that the people they had been taught to hate were capable of kindness and compassion, just as they themselves were. This realization was both liberating and terrifying. It meant that the world they had known, where everything was clear-cut and simple, no longer existed. As the days turned into weeks, the soldiers began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior. They no longer felt the same resentment and hatred they had when they first arrived. They still held on to their pride and loyalty to their homeland, but they began to question whether the animosity they had been raised with was justified. They started to feel empathy for the Americans, for the guards who showed them respect, for the workers who served them food with a smile. This shift in perspective was a quiet one, but it was profound. The coffee, too, played a role in this transformation. At first, it had been a symbol of the absurdity of their situation, a luxury they hadn't expected, a small indulgence that seemed out of place in a prison camp. But as they drank it each day, they began to associate it with something more than just a beverage. It became a ritual, a moment of connection between them and the guards who served it. In those quiet moments, when they sat together and sipped the coffee, they began to share unspoken understanding. They were no longer enemies. They were people, connected by a shared experience. The prisoners also began to notice the way the guards interacted with each other. They weren't just following orders mechanically. They seemed to care about the well-being of the camp, of the prisoners, and of the situation they were all in. There was a sense of camaraderie among the soldiers, a quiet professionalism that was hard to ignore. The prisoners, once resentful of their captors, began to see that the guards were doing their jobs with a level of dignity that was foreign to them. It was a professionalism that, in a strange way, mirrored their own sense of duty to their homeland. They began to see that the guards, too, were trapped in a world that was beyond their control. One afternoon, as the prisoners sat together after lunch, one of the soldiers, an older man who had seen much of the war, spoke up. He said that he had never expected to find himself in a position like this, where he was sitting across from the enemy, drinking coffee, and talking like friends. He admitted that he had been wrong about the Americans, that he had been wrong to hate them. The others sat in silence, absorbing his words. It wasn't that they had fully embraced the idea of peace or reconciliation, but they were beginning to see that their views of the world were too narrow, too limited. The war had taught them to see things in black and white, but now they were discovering that there were shades of gray, areas of life where the lines weren't so clear. The more they thought about it, the more the prisoners realized that their captors had given them something far more valuable than just food or coffee. They had given them the opportunity to see the world differently, to challenge the beliefs that had been instilled in them from birth. And in doing so, they had begun to break down the barriers that had divided them. The guards, once the enemy, were now starting to seem like something else. People who had their own struggles, their own fears, their own hopes for the future. This understanding was not something that could be easily ignored, and it left the prisoners wondering what the future would hold once the war was finally over. This quiet shift in perspective was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The coffee, once a symbol of everything they had been taught to despise, had become a bridge between two opposing worlds. It wasn't the end of their journey, but it was a significant step towards understanding. And in a place that had once seemed like a hell on earth, the possibility of peace, however small, began to take root. The days continued to blend together in the camp as the German prisoners settled into a routine that, though still strange, was beginning to feel like their new normal. The early confusion, the questioning of their captors' motives, was slowly replaced by something more complex: acceptance. They had learned to expect food on time, coffee in the mornings, and a certain level of respect from the guards that had been so foreign to them before. They began to realize that the enemy they had been raised to hate was not so different from themselves. But even as this recognition settled in, a sense of unease lingered, particularly among the older prisoners who had seen the worst of the war. It wasn't just the treatment that was causing this discomfort. It was the realization that their perceptions of humanity were being fundamentally challenged. Each day in the camp, the soldiers saw that their captors, the American soldiers, weren't just doing their jobs. They were showing kindness in a way they hadn't expected. For many of the prisoners, this was a dangerous discovery. They had been taught to see the Americans as monsters, as brutal oppressors. But the people around them were proving to be more human, more compassionate than they ever could have imagined. One afternoon, as the prisoners were gathered for their usual break, Sergeant O'Connor, one of the guards they had gotten to know, approached with a crate of fresh supplies. He was carrying new bedding for the barracks, sheets and blankets that would replace the old, worn-out ones that had been used since their arrival. The sight of the new bedding was an unexpected kindness. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a thoughtful one, something small but meaningful. The prisoners had expected nothing more than the bare minimum to survive, yet here they were being given more comfort than they could have hoped for. O'Connor distributed the new bedding. He spoke in the calm, measured way he always did. There was no sarcasm, no condescension, just a simple request to take good care of the new items. He spoke to them as if they were guests, not prisoners. The words were so ordinary, yet they felt extraordinary in this context. For the first time, one of the prisoners, a young man who had been particularly resistant to the idea of American kindness, looked up at O'Connor with something approaching gratitude in his eyes. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. A realization had begun to take root in the hearts of the prisoners, that the kindness they were being shown wasn't just for show, it was genuine. Later that day, as the prisoners sat around the campfire, they began to talk amongst themselves. The conversation was quiet, measured, as if they were all unsure how to articulate the complexity of what they were feeling. One of the older men, a sergeant who had been through multiple battles, spoke up. He had been a prisoner before, but never under these circumstances. In previous experiences, prisoners were treated with disdain, their basic human dignity stripped away. But here, in this camp, things were different. There was a palpable sense of respect in the air, and it was disorienting. He wondered aloud how many others had felt the same way, and slowly others began to speak. They spoke of their disbelief at the food, at the coffee, at the way the guards treated them. They had come expecting hatred, but they were receiving hospitality instead. It was difficult to reconcile this with the images of American soldiers they had been taught to fear. This moment of collective realization marked a shift in the prisoners' attitudes. They could no longer deny that their captors were not the monsters they had been led to believe. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that they had been wrong, that they had built an image of their enemies that was based on fear and propaganda. It wasn't easy for many of them to accept this. After all, they were still in captivity, still prisoners. But it was impossible to ignore the small, everyday acts of kindness that were being offered to them. There was a tension between their old beliefs and the new reality they were living in, and it left them unsettled. As the days passed, the prisoners continued to witness these small acts of kindness. Sometimes it was the guards allowing them to speak to one another without interruption. Other times it was simple gestures, like offering extra food or giving them a moment of rest. These things seemed so trivial, yet they spoke volumes. For the first time, the prisoners began to question what they had been taught about their enemies. Could it be possible that they had misunderstood the Americans entirely? Could there be more to them than the propaganda they had been fed their entire lives? One morning, as the prisoners were finishing their breakfast, the camp's commander, a man they had been told to fear, approached their group. He greeted them with a nod and spoke briefly about the day's tasks. His tone was firm but not unkind, and as he left, one of the prisoners, an older man who had been especially vocal about his disdain for the Americans, turned to the others with a furrowed brow. He muttered to himself, "He doesn't seem like the monster they made him out to be." The words were quiet, but they were a turning point. For the first time, someone had expressed doubt about the story they had been told. It was a small moment, but it was significant. By the end of the week, the prisoners had begun to see their captors in a different light. They were still prisoners, still subject to the rules of the camp, but the distance between them and the guards had shrunk. They could no longer deny that the Americans were capable of kindness. And in that realization, a new tension arose. How could they go back to seeing their captors as enemies after everything they had experienced? The coffee, the food, the bedding, the polite conversations, they were all small things, but they had changed everything. The prisoners were beginning to see their captivity in a new way, and it left them questioning everything they had believed up until that point. Yet, as the days passed, there was still a sense of wariness that lingered. Despite the kindness they were receiving, they could not forget the larger context of the war. They were still prisoners, still at the mercy of their captors. And so, as the small shifts in their perceptions took root, they were also cautious. They did not yet trust fully, nor were they ready to abandon their old beliefs completely. But, for the first time, they allowed themselves to entertain the possibility that their enemies were not all bad, and that maybe, just maybe, there was more to them than the stories they had been told. The prisoners' sense of unease began to grow stronger as they continued their days in the camp. Despite the politeness, the kindness, and the unexpected comforts, there was still a lingering tension in the air. They had been raised to believe that their captors were the embodiment of evil, that their enemies would stop at nothing to break them, to humiliate them. But here they were, treated with a level of respect and decency that contradicted everything they had been taught. It left them in a state of confusion that no amount of food or coffee could quell. They began to question their own identities, their roles in this new world where the lines between friend and foe were no longer as clear. For many of the soldiers, the internal conflict was becoming more difficult to manage. They could no longer ignore the humanity in their captors, and it disturbed them. How could they reconcile the image of the enemy they had been raised with, men who were cruel, heartless, and deserving of nothing but contempt, with the reality of the guards who greeted them every day with kindness and even humor? They had expected to be beaten, starved, and broken, but instead they were treated with dignity, and that dignity came from people who had once been considered enemies. The contradiction was profound. It made them uneasy in ways they didn't fully understand. One evening, as the men sat around in their barracks, the topic of the Americans' kindness came up again. This time, the conversation was more somber, more reflective. They had begun to talk not just about the way they had been treated, but about how they had been taught to view their enemies throughout their lives. A few of the younger soldiers, who had been more resistant to the idea of the Americans being anything other than monsters, now found themselves uncertain. They had come to this camp thinking of the Americans as a faceless enemy, but over time they had seen that there was nothing faceless about them. The soldiers were human beings, just like them. It was a difficult realization. It seemed to shake the very foundation of their identities. If the Americans were human, if they were capable of kindness, then what did that say about the way they had been raised to view the world? The idea that their enemies might not be so different from themselves was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it opened the door to the possibility of peace, understanding, and reconciliation. But on the other hand, it made the war they had fought seem less justifiable. How could they have fought so fiercely, so bitterly, against people who, in some ways, were no different from themselves? The older soldiers were perhaps the most conflicted. They had seen the worst of the war, had been on the front lines, and had witnessed horrors they could not forget. For them, the enemy was something they could never fully accept as human. They had been taught to hate, to fight with everything they had, and to view their opponents as evil incarnate. Yet here they were, sitting with those very enemies and drinking coffee, a drink that symbolized comfort and peace, not war. It was almost too much to bear. Their minds raced as they tried to process the contradiction. How could the same people who had destroyed their homes, their cities, and their families now offer them a kind of comfort they had never imagined? At the same time, there was a growing sense of gratitude among the prisoners. As much as they struggled with the confusion, they couldn't deny that they were being given more than they ever thought possible. The American soldiers, despite being their captors, had shown them more humanity than they had received from their own government in years. The idea that their captors cared for their well-being, that they were offering them warmth and kindness, made the prisoners feel something they had almost forgotten: hope. It wasn't an overwhelming feeling, but it was enough to start changing their perspective. The younger soldiers, particularly those who had been in the war for a shorter time, began to look at the guards differently. They were no longer just the enemy. Some of them even began to converse with the guards, learning about their lives, their families, their experiences. This was a step forward, an acknowledgement that the barriers they had once erected between themselves and the Americans were not as unbreakable as they had thought. The conversations were brief, but they were significant. For the first time, the prisoners were able to see their captors as people, not just soldiers. However, for the older soldiers, the realization was more difficult. They had lived through enough to know that not everything could be explained away so easily. They couldn't just wipe away the years of hatred and distrust. The past was too heavy, and it clung to them like a shadow. Even though they could see the humanity in the Americans, they still struggled with the idea that they had been wrong about them. The propaganda they had been raised on was too deeply ingrained. It was hard to just let go of everything they had been taught, especially when the cost of letting go seemed so high. What did it mean for their sense of identity, their sense of duty, if they accepted that the Americans weren't monsters, but people? Despite these challenges, the prisoners began to experience a shift. The more they interacted with the guards, the more they understood that there was no clear line between good and evil, no simple division between the us and the them. In some ways, it was a relief. In other ways, it was terrifying. The world had always been a place where enemies were clearly defined, where there was no ambiguity. But now, as they sat across from their captors, sharing meals, sharing coffee, and sometimes even laughing together, the world they had known was beginning to crumble. This internal struggle became a daily battle for the prisoners. They couldn't just shut off their past beliefs, couldn't ignore the years of propaganda that had shaped their worldview. But as the days passed, they began to see their captors in a new light. Slowly, very slowly, the walls they had built around themselves began to crack. The coffee, the food, the small gestures of kindness, they had all chipped away at the barrier of hatred that had once seemed so impenetrable. And although they were still prisoners, still in the hands of their captors, they began to feel that, perhaps, they were also participants in something much larger than the war they had been fighting. As the war drew closer to its end, and the prisoners began to feel the weight of their prolonged captivity, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the camp started to emerge. The men who had once viewed their situation with suspicion and fear began to see it differently. The kindness they had been shown by their American captors, though initially baffling, had begun to transform their understanding of what it meant to be human. But this transformation came at a price, and with the end of the war now in sight, the prisoners could not ignore the complexities of what they had experienced. The arrival of the news that the war was ending sent shockwaves through the camp. It wasn't just a moment of relief, it was a moment of reckoning. For years, these soldiers had been entrenched in a conflict that divided the world into opposing camps, where the enemy was dehumanized and reduced to a symbol of everything that was wrong. Now, with the knowledge that their side had lost, and with the dawning realization that their captors were not so different from themselves, the soldiers were forced to confront the full scope of their experiences. The quiet moments, once filled with the simple pleasures of coffee and conversation, now carried a heavy weight. The realization that they had been wrong about their enemies, and perhaps wrong about the entire nature of war itself, was overwhelming. They had come to this camp expecting brutality, expecting to be broken down by their captors. Instead, they had been treated with dignity and respect. And in that kindness, they had seen the humanity of those they had once considered monsters. But this new understanding came with a sense of loss, as the soldiers grappled with the contradiction of finding compassion in the very people they had been taught to despise. One evening, as the prisoners sat together in the barracks, the conversation turned to the war itself. For the first time, the guards were included in the discussion. It wasn't just the prisoners who were struggling to make sense of the past few months, it was the guards, too. They spoke of their own experiences, their own struggles with the conflict. Many of them had joined the military as young men, motivated by patriotism or a sense of duty, but they had grown weary of the violence. They, too, were trapped in a war that seemed to offer no solution, no end. The prisoners, for the first time, saw the guards not just as enemies, but as people who had been shaped by the same forces of conflict, who had suffered in ways they hadn't fully understood before. This shared humanity, this recognition that both sides had been caught in a system of violence and hatred, was a sobering realization. The soldiers began to talk about what would come next. The war was over, but what would happen to the world after? What would happen to them? The men who had once fought for their country, driven by a sense of duty and honor, now found themselves questioning the very ideas that had driven them into battle. What had they been fighting for? What was the point of all the suffering, the death, the destruction? The war had ended, but the questions about the true cost of conflict lingered in their minds. The news of the war's end brought a wave of mixed emotions to the camp. On one hand, there was relief, a sense of finality that the violence and death had stopped. But on the other hand, there was a deep sadness. The soldiers had been trained to fight for their country, to uphold its honor, but now they had to face the reality that their country had lost. And with that loss came a sense of guilt. How could they reconcile the kindness they had been shown with the actions of their homeland? How could they look at the American soldiers who had treated them with such respect and still hold on to the hatred they had been taught? It was an internal battle that each soldier had to face in his own way. As the days passed, the prisoners began to prepare for their return home. The war was over, but the scars it had left on them were not easily erased. They packed their belongings, which had become strangely precious in the months of captivity. There was the small notebook given to them by a guard, the American-issued coffee mugs, the extra blankets that had been provided. Simple things, but they had come to symbolize a new understanding. These objects were not just reminders of their time in captivity. They were symbols of the unexpected mercy they had received. On the day of their departure, the soldiers gathered in the camp one last time. The guards were there too, standing at a distance, their faces a mixture of relief and sadness. The soldiers exchanged brief words with them, words that carried more weight than any conversation they had had before. It wasn't just a farewell, it was an acknowledgement of everything that had changed during their time in captivity. They had come as enemies, but they were leaving with a shared understanding that transcended the boundaries of nationality and conflict. As they boarded the transport that would take them home, the soldiers looked back at the camp one last time. The world they were returning to was a world of uncertainty. Their country had been defeated, their cities destroyed, and the war they had fought in seemed like a distant, fading memory. But for the first time, they didn't feel the same animosity they had once felt toward the Americans. The kindness they had received had changed them, had opened their eyes to a new understanding of what it meant to be human. It wasn't that they had forgotten the pain of the war or the loss of their comrades, but they had learned something profound during their time in captivity, that even in the midst of conflict, there was room for mercy, for compassion, for humanity. As the transport ship sailed away from the American shore, the soldiers sat in silence, reflecting on the journey they had taken, not just across the ocean, but within themselves. They had come to the camp expecting to be broken, to be treated as less than human, but instead they had been shown the very best of humanity. It was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives, a lesson that would shape their understanding of the world and the people they would encounter in the future. The war was over, but the reckoning of what it meant to be human, what it meant to show mercy, had only just begun.